Welcome to the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Hosted by John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 11 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today we'll be talking with Alexandre Philippe, director of the new documentary film The People vs. George Lucas, which explores the love-hate relationship that Star Wars fans have for the legendary director. You know, just this morning, I just on a whim, I Googled George Lucas in Google image search, and one of the first images that comes up is this guy who has a tattoo on his shoulder. It's just giant. It's like fills up his whole shoulder of Darth Vader holding a lightsaber, and also holding George Lucas's decapitated head. And it seems like that really just kind of encapsulates the relationship between Star Wars fans and George Lucas. You know, like they love him so much that they have his face tattooed on their body, but you know, and this character he created tattooed on their body, but you know, also expressing just the most you know, sort of vitriolic outrage at the same time. And it really is. It's not like a dislike relationship. It's a true love-hate relationship. So I think that'll be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing this documentary. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I'm sure he interviewed a lot of really, really interesting people.
Interesting is the polite way to put it.
And, you know, we also, I want to thank Matt Rotundo, science fiction author, who's one of my LiveJournal friends, and he was interviewed for this movie and was told that he actually, you know, makes an appearance in the movie. And so he blogged about that on his journal, and then I saw it, and that's how I heard about this movie and watched the trailer and thought it looked really good. And, you know, I just watched this trailer and I was like, wow, we have got to get the director of this on the phone and talk about this, because it looks like a lot of fun. So that's what we'll be doing. And then stick around after the interview where John and I will be reminiscing about Star Wars and talking about what works and what doesn't, in our humble opinion.
All right, well, let's do it. Let's get Philippe on the phone.
Hello.
Hi, this is Dave and John from Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, how are you guys?
Great. So, you know, usually, first of all, we would just ask you a little bit about yourself, but we have a question which we think is just going to tell us everything that we need to know about you, which is, how would you personally rank the 6 Star Wars movies from best to worst?
That's a great question. Well, you know, it's actually quite a tricky question, because usually when you ask this to people from my generation, you know, the original Star Wars generation, people will usually say Empire Strikes Back. I think that Empire is the best of the movies. I think my favorite is still the original Star Wars, because that's really, you know, where it all started. So I would say in order of, you know, from best to worst, I would go 5, 4, 6, 3, 2, 1. And in order of preference, I would go 4, 5, 6, 3, 2, 1.
Good answer.
I don't know, though. There's no way that the Attack of the Clones is not the worst movie, but that's a debate for another time, perhaps.
Well, you know, I'm happy to put them together in a bundle. You know, 1 and 2. I'm really not fond of them at all.
Yeah, it's a fine distinction between levels of crappiness, I suppose. But
yeah.
Okay, how did you get the idea to make The People versus George Lucas, and what was the process of creating it like?
Well, the idea really came to me several years ago, and you know, it's funny because I've always sort of had the title in my head, because you know, it's really hard to have 2 Star Wars fans in a room without starting some kind of an argument about George Lucas, about, you know, whether George Lucas is God, whether he's the devil, or whether he's both. And so just that idea was really the spark, you know, behind the project. And you know, we were working on a project, commercial project in Texas back in 2007. And, you know, my director of photography, who was also a huge Star Wars fan, you know, we were just basically talking about Star Wars every single day. And one day I said, you know, hey, I had this idea to make a documentary called The People versus George Lucas. And he immediately, you know, jumped on it. I mean, he said, you know, I really want to do this. I'll be the DP. I want to help produce it. And so he's really the one who kind of pushed me and encouraged me to, you know, to make this happen. And, 3.5 years later, here we are. But it's been a crazy process. We have well over 600 hours of footage that we've collected worldwide. Fans have submitted their own footage from around the world in a variety of formats. Anything from Star Wars Grindhouse to, puppet rants to hour-long webcam rants, animation, claymation, 3D animation, you name it.
So, what was the most impressive fan-submitted thing that you got?
There's so many. I don't want to try and single out. There's this one guy that, off the top of my head who noticed, when he saw our first trailer, that, we shoot our interviews with multiple cameras. And because he only had one camera, he memorized his lines and shot himself from two different angles so we could use that.
How did you go about soliciting the footage from the fans, or how did you put the call out to get people to do this stuff?
We had a set of guidelines that we posted online. We made it very, very friendly for people to essentially understand the process of how to submit to us. We had obviously an FTP where people could just post their footage, and we made it very clear that no matter what kind of format, if they had an HD camera or whether they had just a webcam, they could still submit to us. I didn't want to limit, the type of footage that people could submit to us. This certainly created a huge challenge for us during the post-production process because, it was a real nightmare just dealing with that many formats, PAL, NTSC, all kinds of different frame rates, all kinds of different, types of resolutions.
So, who are some of the biggest, most recognizable names that appear in the movie?
Okay, so we have, I'd say some of the biggest include Gary Kurtz, who obviously produced Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. We interviewed Neil Gaiman. We interviewed Del Pollock, who, wrote the book Skywalking and obviously was George Lucas's biographer. Dave Prowse, of course, Darth Vader himself.
What did Neil Gaiman say? What was his basic take on Star Wars?
All I'll say is that he's not a huge fan of Star Wars as a story. And he was actually talking about the fact that he thinks that maybe he was just a little too old, just a few years too old to really connect with Star Wars the way that, some people did.
So now you went to the World Science Fiction Convention and interviewed some science fiction writers. I'm not sure if that's where you interviewed Neil or not, but you interviewed some writers there. Which other writers did you interview, and what was their general attitude about Star Wars? Did you notice it in general that it was different from other types of fans?
That's a wide question. It's a really tough question to answer because everybody seems to have a very, very unique take on Star Wars and on George Lucas, obviously. But we interviewed Joe Haldeman, Anders, John C. Wright, Lawrence Shawn, a few, just Howard Taylor. The reason why we went to Worldcon in the first place was that we had interviewed David Brin, who wrote a book called Star Wars on Trial, and he's a pretty famous, sci-fi author, obviously. But there's a number of the contributors to the book, Star Wars on Trial, were going to be at Worldcon that year. People will defend George, and people will go after George for all sorts of reasons. So I can't say specifically, what they told me, but suffice it to say there was a wide range of feelings and emotions expressed.
Where else did you do interviews? Did you go to San Diego Comic-Con or anything like that?
We went to Comic-Con. We went to just about all over Europe. We went to Tokyo. We went to Canada, several trips to Los Angeles, several trips to the East Coast.
Are Star Wars fans different in Tokyo than in Canada, or?
Yeah. In fact, the fans in Tokyo have a very, very different take on George and on Star Wars. Culturally, they're amazed that in America we have this ability to debate something like this. and put so much passion and feelings into it. I think they're much more respectful, of George as a whole. They have a hard time understanding why we're so emotionally invested in those movies. That doesn't mean that they're not emotional about them. They just express those emotions very, very differently. So for instance, when I started talking to them about the infamous South Park episode of, the rape of Indiana Jones, you get some really interesting responses from them. It's something along the lines of, wow, America is really intense. We couldn't get away with something like this in Japan.
So, speaking of inspiring passion, who are some of the strangest and or angriest people that you interviewed?
Probably the angriest interviews were, probably not surprisingly, footage that we received from fans. There's one in particular that, he submitted us, I think it was a 7-hour rant on George, on a bunch of hi-8 tapes. And it's really, really priceless. He did some reenactments with action figures and all kinds of, it's really interesting to me because you can see in this guy the absolute love and devotion, and then he will just turn on a dime and start ranting and showing the other side of fandom and showing his profound, anger. So I would say because we never tried to censor anything, the fans really felt that our documentary was a way for them to really express their feelings, and as a result, we did receive a number of very, very over-the-top testimonies. But that's definitely part of the doc as well. And I've made the decision to not censor anything. So there is some language in the doc. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, so I understand you've been getting some death threats from Star Wars fans. What does a death threat from a Star Wars fan sound like? Does it involve the almighty Sarlacc?
No, I haven't received that one yet. Actually, that's interesting. No, we had a couple that were actually, frankly, a little scary and a little disturbing. There's that sense that they felt that we were going after George. That by putting a documentary out there called "The People versus George Lucas," that we were damaging Star Wars, and how dare we do this? It's really unfortunate, and I've always tried, with the most extreme fans to have this communication. Whenever I receive something like this, I'll turn right around and answer them very politely and say, I understand your feelings, I understand how you feel, but you have to understand this is not, we're not going after George. We have a huge amount of respect and love for the guy. We're just, making a documentary film, and we're trying to distance ourselves from this material as fanboys and look at this from the point of view of a documentary filmmaker and looking at this as a cultural phenomenon. Most of the time, these people would actually respond to me and say, oh yeah, well, okay, now I understand why you're making this film. But every now and then, some of these particular fans would get angrier and angrier, and to the point of being really scary. So, and saying we should die and all kinds of things. So, it is what it is. I'm sure George gets a lot more death threats than I do, so it's just part of the process.
See, speaking of really scary, apparently in the movie you interview someone who thinks that the prequels are better than the originals.
I'll tell you a funny anecdote because we went to Paris to interview some French scholars on the topic, and I'm French originally myself, so I can laugh at this as well. But I think the French have this tendency to really overthink things, and a lot of them actually really think that the prequels are better films. I didn't really quite follow their arguments. They got very, very cerebral. But one of them actually went so far as to say that if he wanted to be a little provocative, he'd say that Jar Jar Binks was his favorite character in the entire saga. So you'll see that in the film itself, obviously we do have a segment about Jar Jar, and pretty much the only people who stand up for the character are kids and French scholars.
Maybe he's less offensive and stupid in French.
Well, maybe. Although somehow I just can't imagine that. I think it's probably worse in French.
It was funny. Just last night, I googled "I hate Jar Jar Binks" and it comes up with 47,000 hits. And then just as a control, I googled "I hate Hitler" and it comes up with 49,000. So it's about the same.
Oh. Okay, there you go. That's actually very similar to what I did in the early stages of our documentary. I googled "I hate George Lucas" and I googled "I hate Gene Roddenberry." Just to see the difference. And I think Gene Roddenberry was like 4 hits, and George Lucas was like 12,900, something like that.
One issue that your movie tackles is the phenomenon of Star Wars merchandising. What did people have to say about that?
Well, there is that very conflicted relationship that I think Star Wars fans have with Star Wars merchandise. Because on the one hand, they want it, and they want more of it. And on the other hand, the more they buy, the more frustrated they are because they feel like they're being taken advantage of. So, that's a really interesting question. Is George taking advantage of his fans, or, are his fans just really, shouldn't they be responsible for what they decide to spend their money on? So, I think, it's definitely a question that we explore in the documentary, and, in all fairness to George, he's obviously created a business model that works, and I think anybody in his situation, would probably be doing the same thing.
Do you or any of the crew have any Star Wars merchandise yourself?
Oh, I do. I plead guilty to that, and I certainly have the same, conflicted feelings. I love to spend my money on Star Wars stuff, but I kind of feel bad after the fact. It's just a bunch of plastic, really, of junk that you're buying, and where does it end? That's the thing, is where does it end? there is just so much of it. If you're a Darth Vader collector, there's probably well over 100 different, Darth Vader figures out there with all kinds of variations that you can buy. So it's way out of control, and I think that's what the fans are responding to on a kind of basic level, is this frustration. I think that George has become such a machine, such an empire, and how different that is from the young idealistic filmmaker, who was a rebel back in the day. And I think fans, more than anything, have a hard time reconciling the two Georges.
Well, and it's sort of led to a situation where the cart's kind of before the horse, right? Like I listened to an interview with the guys who wrote the Transformers movie, and they said that the company basically handed them a list of toys that they were going to make and said, put these in the movie.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's, in a sense, that's kind of the legacy of George Lucas, isn't it? And that's yet another sort of layer to that frustration. Is here's a guy who really changed the industry for the better in so many ways. And I think a lot of fans are really pissed that he also changed the industry in very strange, terrible ways. Would we really have this approach to filmmaking? Would we really have a Transformers movie without George Lucas in the first place? That's a very interesting question to ask ourselves. And I would say probably not. So, the bottom line is, George did what he had to do. He followed his path. He made the movies that he believed in, and the industry changed as a result. Is he guilty of that? I don't think so.
I'll say I, for one, would gladly forsake all of my Star Wars merchandise if it meant that we didn't have to have Ewoks in Return of the Jedi.
I actually, I'm not that huge of an Ewok hater myself. They're okay. Certainly, you can see the signs. I think in Return of the Jedi, there was a shift. I think in George Lucas, and I think Jar Jar Binks is probably kind of the extension of that, and the Gophers in Indiana Jones 4, and all these cute, weird little creatures, that seem to have nothing to do really with the story itself. But when you're a kid and you watch Return of the Jedi and you watch the Ewoks, I personally didn't have a problem with that. I still think that Return of the Jedi is very watchable, as a movie. Is it as good as the other two? No, I don't think so. But it has some great moments. I mean, the whole Jabba the Hutt sequence, I think, is great. Obviously, the final duel. With Palpatine thrown into the mix as some of the greatest moments, I think, in the entire Star Wars saga.
I read an interview with you, I think, where you said that the producer for the first two movies parted ways with Lucas sort of over creative differences in Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Gary essentially told us that right around 1984, which was essentially during Raiders of the Lost Ark, he really felt that George was kind of heading in a different direction in terms of storytelling. That he was more interested in the roller coaster ride than he was interested in the storytelling. And he didn't say this as it wasn't a value judgment. It was just an observation. And basically they parted ways. I mean, there's this amazing review of Episode 1, the 70-minute review of Episode 1 that came out on YouTube not so long ago that really deconstructs the episode and just... I mean, it's a really harsh review, but it's very true. I mean, there's nothing there in terms of story or character that I think is engaging. I really think, and with all the love and respect I have for George, I mean, I'm sorry to say, but I think it's a terrible, terrible piece of filmmaking.
No, that's a brilliant piece, that YouTube video, like where they ask people to describe the personalities of the characters in the prequels without reference to their job or their role in the plot.
Yeah, and in fact, these guys have actually participated in our doc as well. We've been in touch with these guys for a while, actually, for another segment that they did on YouTube about Darth Vader's infamous, no moment in Episode 3.
What are those guys actually like? Because they have sort of this sort of creepy persona when presenting the review.
No, actually, not at all. They're totally they're just very cool guys. But they're very good, obviously, at doing some pretty creepy impersonations.
So there's a line in the trailer about how Lucas used to say that he was going to do other things besides Star Wars, and yet he never really has.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing is, the fans are, I think, secretly hoping that George will, step away from Star Wars and do something new, do something, I mean, he's been talking about this for years now, that now that Star Wars is over, he's going to finally be able to make the, personal experimental films that nobody wants to see. But which, in fact, everybody wants to see. And the more time goes by, the more George seems to be really stuck in that Star Wars mode, and probably because it's the safe thing to do, probably because there's a lot of pressure on him to keep making Star Wars, to keep making Indiana Jones or whatever, those big franchises are. And, as Francis Ford Coppola, once put it, I think it's very, very sad that no matter how popular Star Wars was, how many billions of dollars it made, we haven't seen 10% of what George Lucas is capable of as a filmmaker. And I think that's the heartbreak and that's the tragedy of George Lucas. And it's definitely something that we explore in the documentary as well, because you're talking about a guy who is obviously was so full of promise, who delivered on that promise in ways that nobody would have ever imagined, and who just, as a result of that success, just became somebody else. So in terms of filmmaking, if you're a film buff, and you look at the promise that was George Lucas back in the 70s and early 80s, and you look at George Lucas now, it is a form of tragedy. It's terribly sad to start thinking about what could this guy be doing right now if he just let go, if he just decide, it's kind of like Luke, right? He has to let go. He has to trust his feelings.
I mean, one argument people sometimes make is that these big blockbusters, whatever we think of them, make the studios enough money that they can afford to lose money on more sort of individual, smaller projects.
Right.
Do you think Lucas feels pressure from that direction to make money for the studio so that they can support other filmmakers?
Well, it's a hard thing to say. George Lucas is a very mysterious man, but I think if you look at the facts, the facts is he has billions of dollars. He has a movie-making empire. And putting all the pressures aside, which I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on him to do certain things, he is still the one guy who has the money, really, and the capabilities to make anything that he wants. And so for him to say he wants to do these things, for him to say, I want to make these movies, I want to do something, I want to go back to my roots, and to not do it has, I think, to do, and this is my personal interpretation, but I think it has to do with fear. He hasn't done it in so long, and I think the thought of doing something completely different at this time in his life is probably far more terrifying than it is to just continue to do Star Wars. And I think it's a shame. I think George has nothing to prove. No matter what you think of the prequel trilogy or Indiana Jones 4 or any of that stuff, George will always be one of the great filmmakers of all time. And I think it's really okay if he goes out and makes a crappy film and fails, because at least he would have tried. But, I'm not George, so that's ultimately, that's his decision.
So Star Wars now extends far beyond the 6 feature films. What are some of your favorite examples of Star Wars material from the expanded universe?
I'm one of those guys that I just don't really go there. And I think that's actually part of the frustration. Again, from if you look at our generation, to us, Star Wars is 6 movies. Well, actually, it's really 3 movies. but but then there's the other 3 that we have to kind of deal with, right? But it's really the newer generation that seems a lot more invested, I think, in all of the expanded universe and in the video games and in the Clone Wars and all that stuff.
So in recent years, we've seen reboots of Batman, James Bond, and Star Trek. What do you think about the idea of rebooting Star Wars?
Now that's a whole other thing. Absolutely. Now that I would be really all over. And in fact, I think that's the one thing that I think is frustrating to me is how close George Lucas is keeping StarArs to his chest. It's like he doesn't want to let go of it. And what you have to understand is that, the kids who grew up with Star Wars back in the late 70s are now of age. And a lot of these kids have grown into amazing filmmakers. All you have to do is look at J.J. Abrams, rebooting Star Trek as a perfect example of that. And it's hard to imagine that any of these guys, if they got a call from Lucas saying, "Hey, I want you to do your own Star Wars," they'd be chomping at the bit. Nobody would actually say no to that. I think this is exactly what Star Wars needs right now. It needs to, George Lucas needs to let go of it, and other people need to bring their own spin, their own interpretations to the story and the characters of Star Wars. Now, that, I think, would be extremely interesting.
So if people want to check out the documentary, how can they do that?
Well, obviously, we just had our world premiere at South by Southwest. We've already been invited by a number of really, really big festivals around the world, and we're trying to to figure out. We've already accepted 3. There's a bunch of others that we're trying to think about, because we don't want to show the film so much at festivals, because that will take away from our chances of having actually a legitimate theatrical run. So we're still strategizing. How many festivals we want to show it to. Obviously, we want to show it around the world, and we're hoping to get into a fairly quick distribution agreement that will enable us to have not only a theatrical run, but of course eventually a full-on DVD, Blu-ray release. But if you go to our website and check the news section, there's even a tab that, a screenings tab on our website. People can, get the latest information about upcoming screenings.
So do you have any other projects that you'd like to mention?
There's a lot of films that we're currently developing right now. That's unfortunately not something I'm ready to announce just yet. But I will say that we are developing a number of other feature-length documentaries. Some are also pop culture related, and some are, a little more sort of serious, subject matter. And also developing a feature-length Western.
And you did a Star Trek documentary, right?
Yeah. That was a while back, and it was a much smaller production. But it was. It's called Earthlings. It's a documentary that is about the Klingon language phenomenon. It's a much more of a niche documentary. But it's out on DVD in Europe.
Well, we're big in Europe, so probably a lot of our listeners will want to go check that out.
Excellent.
So, Alexandre Philippe, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Alexandre for joining us on the phone.
I'm so surprised there were no blasters during that interview. It just...
yeah, I mean, I can't wait until this movie comes out and we can watch it. It sounds like it's going to be great. So I don't know if you know this, John, but my mom was actually pregnant with me when she went to see Star Wars in the theater.
So that's what happened to you.
Yeah, so she's always maintained that there must have been some sort of prenatal influence.
Yeah.
And then, when I was a kid, my grandmother lived nearby, and so we were always going over to her house, and they would just stick me in front of the TV. And my grandmother had a VCR, which was just, really amazing new technology at the time. It's like, wow, you could actually watch a movie on your television. And she had recorded Star Wars off of I guess it had been on TV or something. And so every single time I went over to her house, I would just watch Star Wars. So I'm sure I had seen that movie. I think I had counted that I had seen it 25 times, by the time I was about age 4. And of course, I think like probably most people our age, I had memorized the whole thing, even before I can really remember. And I don't know, is that the case with you? Did you grow up watching Star Wars?
Yeah, I did too. I mean, I'm a little older than you, so I was 1 when it came out. But I mean, I don't think my parents took me to see it in the theater when I was 1, but I certainly grew up with it. I often wonder if we would have appreciated it even more than we already did. Like if we were maybe 13 or something when we saw it, just because I think it's important that you're not too old when you first see it, but if you're too young too, I think a lot of the cool stuff gets spoiled for you. I just sort of, I felt like I always knew that Darth Vader was Luke's father, spoiler alert,
warning, yeah.
For the 2 people who haven't seen Star Wars yet. But I just I can't help but think of how awesome would it have been to been more of an adult when you'd seen that and be like, oh wow, oh my god, that was so amazing, I would never have seen that coming, but it's just I felt like the movie was spoiled for me when because I kind of rediscovered it when I was about 14 or 15 or whatever. I hadn't seen it in a long time, and I hadn't seen any of the movies in a long time, and so it was I sort of rediscovered it in when I was around 15 or so, and so it kind of felt like a part of the movie was spoiled to me.
Yeah, like our friend Rob, who's a couple years older than us. I mean, he talks about going to see Empire Strikes Back over and over again, and all of his friends talking about are they gonna rescue Han Solo? And and we never had that because I saw Return of the Jedi when I was really young. So. I mean, just basically as soon as I could think, like you were saying, I knew the whole story.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I actually saw Return of the Jedi in the theater, but that's the only one I actually remember seeing in the theater.
Although actually, I don't actually remember seeing it in the theater, but I remember driving over to the toy store afterward to buy a toy.
Yeah. The influence of George Lucas once again. But speaking of Empire Strikes Back, or seeing it in the theater, my sister's ex-husband actually he told me this story one time about how he and his friends skipped school to go watch Empire Strikes Back, like on the first day it started, and so they got there a little early, and so they were at the mall, and so they went into the bookstore, and they were sort of to kill time, and so they saw the novelization of Empire Strikes Back was there in the store, and so my sister's ex-husband just he picked it up and he started flipping through the book, and he just happened to land on the page where it says like Luke, I'm your father, and it's like, oh my God, what were you doing? What were you doing picking up the book and looking through it? Why would you do that?
But like all the kids today, they're like, I like Phantom Menace, and you're like, you stupid kids, but I can remember like when I was a kid that I used to think like Star Wars was really cool and Empire Strikes Back was really boring and Return of the Jedi was really cool.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, like I can remember thinking it was like, there's like action, and I guess when you're a kid, that's all you really care about. You're like, there's no that boring character development and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's funny because, so basically, all growing up, I just thought Star Wars was infallible, basically. And I can remember, I hadn't seen it in a couple of years, I think, and I went off to college, and I came back, and I was home for, Christmas break or something, and I was like, maybe I'll watch Star Wars, so I pop it in, I'm watching, I'm like, oh, it's Star Wars, and then it gets to the part where, they're running around the Death Star, and Leia and Luke run up, and Han Solo and Chewie are there, and he says, what kept you, and Princess Leia says, oh, we ran into some old friends, and I just thought, that's a bad line. I'm like, there's a bad line in Star Wars. And it was like the first time, it was like the first crack, and since then I've come to feel unfortunate that there are there's more than one bad line in Star Wars.
No, don't say that. How could you say that? Wait, I have a bad feeling about this. Where are you going with this?
So yes, but so I still liked, I still pretty much adored, I would say, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, until I guess I was a junior in college. I was in Ireland when Phantom Menace came out, and so I was just really crushed that I wasn't going to get to see it, when it came out. And but that summer I was going to be going to Clarion. It was just a couple weeks after I got back. The Clarion, it's a science fiction writing workshop, and so I thought, well, that'll be. It's not as good as seeing it in the movie when it comes out, but it's that's pretty good. I'll go, and there'll be all these other science fiction fans, and we can all. I'm sure they all will have seen it already, but I'm sure they'll want to go again, and we can all go, and so I get to Clarion, and I'm like, hey guys, let's go see Star Wars, and they're like, nah, and I was like, but it's Star Wars, and they're like, nah, it's not any good, and so I didn't get to see it. That I couldn't get anyone, even at a science fiction writing workshop, I couldn't get anyone to go with me, and so I finally saw it. I don't know, a couple months later with some friends from high school. And by that time, like my expectations when I saw it were like 1% of what my expectations had been, just because everyone had said how bad it was. And then I saw it, and it was like 1% of my newly revised expectations, So, I mean, I can't even imagine what it would have been like if I had my original expectations going in to see it. I seriously think my heart would have just stopped.
Yeah. I think I must have been in denial after I saw it, because obviously like all of us, I was like super excited to go see it, and I made elaborate plans to see it like on the first day and all that. So I saw it, and it didn't really sink in for quite a while that God, it's not a good movie, But one of the reasons why, like when we were talking to Alexandre in the interview, I sort of said, well, there's no way that Attack of the Clones is not the worst movie because
about that. I had a question actually on that subject. Okay. What are you smoking?
What do you think? Phantom Menace is clearly worse, or?
Yeah. I mean, they're both pretty bad, but I think Phantom Menace is way worse.
Well, I think that Phantom Menace has more redeeming qualities to it. I don't think either of them are good movies at all, but. I think like Attack of the Clones, I don't really remember. Yeah. It's sort of, it was just kind of mediocre, and it's sort of forgettable to me. No. There's so many things about Phantom Menace I'm still just apoplectic about. I mean, like Jar Jar Binks. Well, right. Yeah. Well, he's in Attack of the Clones too, isn't he?
Yeah, but just barely. Because he was so unpopular. They trimmed him down to just barely there. Midichlorians. Right. The miraculous conception of Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Scott, Jake Lloyd, I could probably go on, but I mean, To me, there's nothing in Attack of the Clones that makes me that angry.
You're making some good points, but there's there was nothing that bothered me as much as that stupid scene in the robot factory where like C-3PO gets like dismembered or whatever, and they're on that stupid, and there's that super conveyor belt. It's like just such a stupid scene. I couldn't believe what I was watching. Like what the hell is going on here? Why is this in the movie? It's like, it was just like, it was so frustrating. It's like, and I think that to me more than anything is why I hate Attack of the Clones so much. I mean, obviously it's terrible. I mean, like every time Hayden Christensen speaks, it's like, oh God, stop speaking.
Well, the part that sticks out for me in that movie is where like Obi-Wan Kenobi rides around on this like giant cartoon lizard.
Yeah,
that was Attack of the Clones, right?
I don't remember. I think I must have blocked that out.
But that's one of those things where you're just like didn't like hundreds of people work on this movie? Like I can't believe that like 98% of them weren't like, dude, they're gonna put a giant cartoon lizard into it, and Obi-Wan Kenobi's gonna ride around on it, and there's nothing we can do to stop them.
Yeah, but what I was gonna say about Phantom Menace, like the reason I felt like it was redeemed is because I just liked Darth Maul so much, and the fight scene with him at the end is so cool. Even though like the mechanism by which Obi-Wan is prevented from helping Qui-Gon is like just so stupid and ridiculous. It's just that the fight scene is so cool with him. He was such a cool villain that I really enjoyed him, and there was nobody like that in Attack of the Clones. So like I don't know, that did a lot to redeem the movie for me. And although the pod race thing was pretty stupid, it was pretty to look at, and I don't know that there was anything sort of equivalent in Attack of the Clones.
Yeah, see, Darth Maul is pretty cool. I actually kind of like General Grievous, like not the way he talks, right? But his just like physical design, I think, is really cool, and that he has 4 arms and they can, that kind of stuff. Like they could have done so much cool stuff with him.
And worst name ever.
No. Come on. Well, Count Dooku is in the same movie.
Okay, yeah. Maybe that's worse. Yeah, George came up with a bunch of terrible names for the prequels, didn't he? I mean, Jar Jar Binks is pretty bad, too. But yeah, Grievous and Dooku, those are both pretty terrible names.
Yeah, I heard he said that he like lets his kids name the villains or something. Which, you can certainly believe, but I don't want this to turn into a gigantic prequel hate fest. So why don't we move on to our next topic?
Yeah, I was gonna say at the top of the show that this will be the episode in which we alienate half our viewers.
But so Alexander ranked. Okay, well, what do you think is the best of the Star Wars movies?
Oh yeah, no, Empire Strikes Back, I think clearly. So I mean, I think I'd probably rate them in this. Well, I'd rate them similar to him. I'd go 5, 4, 6, 3, 1, 2. So just because like as I said, Attack of the Clones is the worst for me. So.
Mm-hmm. See, I actually prefer the original Star Wars.
Oh, do you? Okay.
So I mean, Empire Strikes Back is really good too. I mean, they're very close to me,
mm-hmm.
but I have to confess I've always found Empire Strikes Back a little slow,
mm-hmm.
and I honestly always fall asleep at the Dagobah stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just kind of have a low tolerance for Muppets teaching Zen. But like there's this part where it's raining, and like R2-D2 gets up on his tiptoes and looks in the window, and
mm-hmm.
And Luke starts being kind of more whiny than usual, mm-hmm. and I'm always at that part. I'm just like, must stay awake. I mean, there's so much good stuff in Empire Strikes Back. I mean, there's the the battle on Hoth I love,
mm-hmm.
and the sort of climactic
mm-hmm.
finale I really love, and the fact that it ends on a really unresolved, unsettled kind of downer note. And I mean, that's one of my favorite endings, where they're just standing on the ship looking out into space, and everything's so unsettled, and and that's the end. I don't know, maybe it's just because I watched Star Wars growing up so much,
mm-hmm.
but the first movie. But I don't know, it just has I think I always kind of like the beginnings of things more.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of noticed this with even like role-playing games, like you start out as a level 1 character and you get like lots of ability, like when you go from like level 1 to level 5, you get a lot of new abilities, whereas
mm-hmm.
once you start going from like level 15 to level 20, it doesn't make that much difference anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would always just like start a new character and get up to level 12 or something, and then be like, oh, my favorite part of the game is over. Let me start over. And it's like start a new character and just do that over and over again. Because I really like having a, that idea of a character who's like new, like everything's new to them, and they just develop really quickly. And so like in Star Wars, all the characters, they all don't know each other, and they are all kind of suspicious of each other, and they all hate each other basically to start with. And by the end of the movie, they're all friends, and Luke had been just like this normal kid, and now he's like the hero of the rebellion and stuff. And just that process, there's such a change in all the characters, and in a sequel, you can never really replicate that that first big jolt of everything's new and everything changes. And I still really, the scene where they blow up the Death Star is probably my favorite sequence in movies. I just love that so much. But I was thinking actually that what Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. Oh, I should say actually that I'm not such a fan of Return of the Jedi.
I know I was going to call you on that because I know you've trashed it before.
And I mean, like Alexandre was saying, there's some really good stuff in there, like the like he was saying, the Jabba the Hutt intro sequence, and the confrontation between Luke and Emperor Palpatine is great. But yeah, like the Ewoks are really irritating, and the thing about Luke and Leia being siblings, I even when I was 4 years old, I'm just like, he's like, Leia, you're my sister, and I'm just like, no, she's not. I don't believe this. This is not I just don't. I'm sorry. I don't believe this is happening. And it wasn't really until I had watched Phantom Menace that I started really disliking Return of the Jedi. But like really, what Phantom Menace was like for me was like an anti-Star Wars vaccine. And how a vaccine works, right? Is they introduce a dead form of the virus into your body, and so your body can analyze it and develop antibodies, and then when the live virus comes in, you're all like armed and ready and primed against it. And that's what Phantom Menace was like for me, because all the Star Wars movies have some of the same things that are wrong with Phantom Menace, but they're not so noticeable. But like Phantom Menace just like shoves them in your face to such a degree that you can't go back and watch the other Star Wars movies without noticing them, and most of all in Return of the Jedi.
When you just were talking about the way the things that are wrong with Star Wars are sort of shoved in your face in Phantom Menace, I just had a flash of those like super cool droid warrior things that they had in there, but then they say Roger Roger all the time. It's like, oh god, that's so dumb. Why do they do that? It's like they're so cool otherwise. And it's just like fun to watch them get like thrown around by force blasts and all that, and they're just like a cool sort of robot warrior, but then he had to make them all cute, and it was just dumb. But as far as I know you were saying how you don't like Return of the Jedi that much. I mean, although as I said, Empire is my favorite of the Star Wars movies. I think my favorite moments in Star Wars is actually in Return of the Jedi, and it's that climactic battle between Vader and Luke. I don't know. I love that so much that it's it redeems everything it redeems what's wrong with Jedi to me, so that I still find it watchable. I mean, even though I'm as much of a Ewok hater as anybody.
Well, no, but I mean, that's such a great moment when Palpatine says, your friends on the moon are walking into a trap now. Pull the power of this fully armed and operational battle station, and then he blows away, one of the rebels' biggest ships. And you're like, oh man. And so I was thinking about that. I was like, what makes that so good? And what makes scenes like that in Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back so good? And I was thinking, like, really what makes Star Wars work for me is good people dying, right? And like every moment, every scene where good people are dying is a powerful scene to me. And to the extent that good people die makes the movies powerful to me. And to the extent that good people don't die makes them feel like a kind of overbearing amusement park ride, right? And so like in order for action to be interesting, at some level you have to feel that the danger is real. And in order for you to feel that the danger is real, I think you have to see good people dying. So I'm thinking like all my favorite stuff from Star Wars is like from the very beginning, where Princess Leia's on the ship, and the stormtroopers bust in, and the hallway is just littered with the security forces of the ship, and they're just being gunned down as they flee, and it immediately establishes, you're like, oh man, this is scary,
And then they blow up a planet.
Yeah, and that's when that's really dramatic when Tarkin is saying, give me this information or I blow up this whole planet of innocent people. I mean, that's a really compelling situation. And then he does it, and then it's even more, scary. And like one of my favorite moments, it's a small moment, but one of my favorite moments in Empire Strikes Back is where, Han Solo goes to the command center on Hoth, and, it's been kind of blown up. And he says, I heard the command center had been hit. I'm getting you to your ship. And as he's crossing the room, you hear an announcement come over the loudspeaker, and it says, Imperial troops have entered the base. Imperial troops have entered the psh, and it cuts out, and it's cutting out because that was an innocent person, or that was a good person who just got killed, and that makes it scary. And in Return of the Jedi, and in the prequels, there's just so many scenes where they're like afraid to kill the good guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's part of what Alexandre was talking about, like the sort of change that happened in George Lucas, that alienated the producer from what he was doing. I think, because it became so much about merchandising. I mean, that's clearly why the Ewoks are in the movies, for merchandising reasons, but also that sort of influenced, I think, how he shaped that movie, Jedi, and the other three in the prequels, that he tried to make it much more kid friendly, and so to do that, he sort of scaled back the violence, especially to the good guys.
I actually heard that they had, it was originally planned, I think, that it was going to be Wookiees, in Return of the Jedi, which would have been awesome, but I guess it was like, I don't know, I heard it was too expensive to make all those Wookiee costumes, and the Ewok costumes were cheaper to make because they're half as big or something. I don't know if that's true, but it seems like I read a quote one time where Lucas was saying that, the Ewoks defeating the Empire, it's like a small, or like a less well-armed group beating a better armed group like Vietnam, like the Vietnam War or something like that. And where that parallel breaks down to me is that in Vietnam, apparently, at the beginning of the American involvement, Ho Chi Minh said to the Americans, the best that your soldiers can hope to accomplish is to kill 9 of us for every one of you that we kill. And even at that rate, you'll still lose and we'll still win, because we're all willing to die for this, and you're not all willing to die for this. And so, like, in order for something like Return of the Jedi to be, like the Ewoks winning, to be credible to me, was like, if they just have tons and tons of Ewoks, and 4 or 5 of them get blown away for each stormtrooper that they take down, or something like that, because there's like, because it just makes the stormtroopers like this legion of my best troops. It just makes them seem like such a joke when they just get overrun by these teddy bears, and there's like one Ewok who dies. And the camera, it's such a big deal. Like, oh no, one Ewok died.
Yeah, but speaking of the Ewoks, I think in the much maligned special edition versions of Star Wars, that's one positive thing that Lucas did with those, is that he eliminated that Jub Jub song that they would sing at the end of Return of the Jedi. Now it's something else. It's less stupid. I'm pretty sure it's still stupid, but.
When I was talking about innocent, like good people dying, the parts of the prequels that are most memorable to me, follow that same pattern. Like when Anakin slaughters the Jedi kids, that's like a moment where I sort of woke up for a moment. I was kind of like, whoa, this is actually turning into a real story again here.
Yeah.
Or like when,
or even when he goes to slaughter all the Sand People too. I mean, that was pretty good.
That was a nice, except they cut away from it, and so,
I know,
in a very cheesy sort of way. But
I know I'll always hate them for that.
But also when the order, whatever it is, Order 66 or whatever, it gets issued, and all the clone troopers turn against the Jedi and kill them all. That was like the best part of that movie for me. But it's sort of interesting because I wonder, since Star Wars is something that I grew up with, and all the kids today, I mean, who knows what they'll think in 10 or 15 years or whatever, but they seem to like the prequels just fine. And so, like, my deepest fear kind of is that the original Star Wars movies actually are as bad as the prequels. And I just, I'm just blind to it because of the nostalgia and because of the familiarity and stuff like that. When I was at the Odyssey writing workshop, there was a student there who had never seen Star Wars. And we're all like, oh my God, you have to watch Star Wars. And so we got Star Wars and we put it in, and we're just like, okay, just, prepare yourself for the most powerfully transcendent experience probably of your entire life, And it was really just sort of disconcerting watching her reactions to seeing Star Wars, as a, being 18 or whatever, and watching it for the first time. She's just like, wait, they have a werewolf too? I'm like, no, dude, it's Chewbacca. Come on, that's Chewbacca there. And and she's like, what? He just howls, and like the guy can understand what he's saying, And she had like all these like problems like that with it. So when I was at USC, I actually took a class with Irvin Kershner, who actually directed Empire Strikes Back, and so he actually talked about that a little bit, which was always really interesting. And so he said, because George Lucas had been a student of his at USC. And so, like a bunch of directors, would all get together at Francis Ford Coppola's house and watch movies, and Lucas would come over and show them kind of footage of Star Wars as he was filming it. And they would all be like, hey, that's great, George, really great, And then he'd leave, and they'd all just look at each other and shake their heads and be like, what is he thinking? This is going to be just the dumbest movie ever. And so, like, all the adults, just didn't get it at all, when Lucas was making it, and they didn't, like the studio executives, they didn't even want to release it, or just, barely wanted to release it. And apparently he was just like begging them, just screen it before a younger audience, And so, so Kershner described how, the studio arranged to screen it before a college audience. And so all the studio execs are sort of standing in the back of the theater, and the college students are sitting there, and they start the movie. And he's like, and the college students just like started screaming, almost as soon as the first like Star Destroyer flies across the screen. This college students were just like screaming with enthusiasm, and like didn't stop screaming, and the movie went on, and they're all just like freaking out. And the studio execs are kind of like standing at the back of the room, kind of glancing at each other and being like, are you seeing what I'm seeing?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually one of the things that has always astounded me about Star Wars, and I think is probably a large reason why it has such a profound effect on so many people, is that the special effects were like so far ahead of its time. I mean, if you look at other movies from that period, even movies 20 years after that, I mean, it's like the special effects are so good that it's like we're only now sort of catching up to them with like digital effects and stuff. I mean, like for instance, like in the prequel movies, like I think that's actually a step backward from what Star Wars did. I mean, for the most part, I mean, like a lot of the computer generated effects that they use, like I mean, they just look phony to me. Whereas the effects in Star Wars all look like they were all part of the same universe, Yeah. So
like just the other day, I was watching the scene. Jabba the Hutt is throwing people to the Sarlacc. And in the the version they have out now, they added this like sort of CG beak kind of thing to it, and it just stands out. I mean, I had completely forgotten that was there, but you just see it and you're just like, that looks like a computer generated thing just stuck in this otherwise consistent milieu, But another story that I don't know if I've told you this story, but he had this funny story about when they were filming Empire Strikes Back, and in the prequels, like the scenes between Anakin and Padme are just so sort of schmaltzy and cheesy. They're just painful. And so apparently, as written, the scene where Han Solo is frozen in carbonite, Princess Leia says "I love you," and in the script Han Solo was supposed to say "I love you too," and it was supposed to be a real horrible Anakin and Padme sort of moment. And I don't remember. It was either Harrison Ford or Kershner was just like, no, this is not going to work. Yeah, but they couldn't come up with an alternative, and they were just doing take after take, and Kershner was just sort of feeding him, alternative lines, and they were just like, nah, this isn't working. And so finally they're like, well, let's do one more take before we break for lunch. And so he's like, just, Harrison, just improvise something. And so Princess Leia says, I love you. And Harrison Ford says, I know. And he's saying I know because they'd already done like 12 takes of her saying, I love you. But, and it was just kind of a joke, And Kirshner's like, okay, that's great. Let's go with that. And everyone was kind of like, you can't be serious. He's like, no, that's perfect. That's exactly what that character would say.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that it came off like that. That's how that came about, because that was perfect. I mean, it's like, that's such a memorable scene the way it is, and it's like if they had done it as scripted, it would have been lame, as you said. So,
so did you ever read this book that Alexandre was talking about, the Star Wars on Trial?
No.
It's pretty good. It's kind of like they have all these charts. It's David Brin edited it, and it sort of lays out all these charges, and then it alternates, sort of a scene or a chapter criticizing Star Wars and then a chapter defending it. And it was really good, like in the best sorts of arguments like that, where I would read the chapter of criticism and say like, yeah, I agree with that. And then read the rebuttal and say, no, actually I agree with that too, and sort of go back and forth like that. But I don't want to spend too much time, since people can just check out the book if they're curious. But I wanted to mention what some of these charges are and maybe get your response to some of these. Mm-hmm. So the charges are: 1, the politics of Star Wars are anti-democratic and elitist. 2, while claiming mythic significance, Star Wars portrays no admirable religious or ethical beliefs. 3, Star Wars novels are poor substitutes for real science fiction and are driving real SF off the shelves. 4, science fiction filmmaking has been reduced by Star Wars to poorly written special effects extravaganzas. 5, Star Wars has dumbed down the perception of science fiction in the popular imagination. 6, Star Wars pretends to be science fiction but is really fantasy. 7, women in Star Wars are portrayed as fundamentally weak. And 8, the plot holes and logical gaps in Star Wars make it ill-suited for an intelligent viewer. Do you have any reactions to any of those?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I thought of when you were reading off those charges is that while I'm inclined to say that, maybe filmmaking has been reduced to poorly written special effects extravaganzas, but, I don't know. I'm not sure that science fiction films weren't like that already before Star Wars,
Well, there's this argument. I wasn't alive at the time, so I'm... Mm-hmm. I don't really have much of a perspective on this, but people seem to think that science fiction was on the verge of becoming more respectable with stuff like 2001 and Blade Runner, and then the Star Wars juggernaut came along. It just kind of made it all Buck Rogers kind of stuff again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's possible. I guess we'd have to talk to people who were adults at the time to really analyze that, but. I think Star Wars ultimately has probably done more good than harm, just because it's, like for people like us, like Star Wars and Star Trek, like you could sort of criticize them both for similar reasons, but I think they're just so largely responsible for drawing so many people to science fiction that if you're going to criticize it for what it did to science fiction, I don't know that that's really fair. As to some of the other charges about Star Wars pretending to be science fiction but it's really fantasy, well, that's definitely true. That was one of the things I was really disappointed to learn as I sort of learned some science, that Star Wars is just it's almost completely BS as far as any kind of scientific plausibility goes. Gene Cavellos actually wrote a book called the Science of Star Wars, and so I read that in college. I actually wrote a paper on it for a science fiction class, and it was pretty disheartening to learn all the stuff that is just just no way possible. From the blasters to the lightsabers. Of course, the lightsaber is the big thing. It's like, oh man, lightsabers aren't possible? That sucks. And of course, the Force is the big thing. It's like, well, that's obviously some sort of magic system and is completely fantasy. So,
well, it seems to me that Star Wars is mostly or largely to blame for what seems to be the average person's sense that light speed is really, really, really fast, mm-hmm. and you can just hop from one side of the galaxy to the other if you're traveling at light speed. Mm-hmm. There was a thing in Spaceballs where they're like, we're going to light speed, and Rick Moranis' character says, no, light speed's too slow. We're gonna have to go all the way to ludicrous speed. And that really is the case. Light speed on a galactic scale, like Han Solo says, I've flown from one side of this galaxy to the other. If ships travel at light speed, it's going to take 100,000 years to cross a galaxy the size of ours. And
right.
I've heard people try to argue maybe the Star Wars galaxy, it's really, really compressed or small or something. But I just don't buy that. I just think,
Well, I mean, they're not actually traveling at light speed; they're exceeding light speed. I mean, because they make the jump to hyperspace or whatever. They also use that term, right? So,
well, it seems like just if you listen to what they say we're going to make the jump to light speed, and I think a lot of people sensibly assume that they're traveling at light speed, and Actually, speaking of Jean Cavellis, because she actually wrote the charge, women in Star Wars are portrayed as fundamentally weak. And this is actually something that I do find really irritating in movies where, she talks about how in Star Wars, in the original Star Wars, Princess Leia is this really dynamic, fiery character. And as starting in Empire Strikes Back, or even, I guess, starting toward the end of Star Wars, she doesn't get her own ship or anything to attack the Death Star, but it's sort of like, they start out with female characters who are really sort of strong and dynamic, and it's like they just can't help making them like the love interest and or the mom, nurturer, whatever. It seems like, all those lines, when they're sort of divvying up lines, they can't help giving all those kinds of lines to the female characters.
Right.
It was kind of the same thing in The Matrix. I guess you never watched the sequels, but it was, when you first see Trinity, in the first scene of The Matrix, she's this total like badass character, and as the movies go on, she just becomes kind of the girlfriend / mom kind of character.
Right. Yeah. As for one of the other charges that that Star Wars portrays no admirable religious or ethical beliefs. Like, I mean, and I don't care if it portrays any admirable religious beliefs, but I mean, as far as ethical beliefs, like, I don't know, I think it probably does, right? I mean, it's got this clear, light and dark side of the Force thing, and obviously, going to the dark side is bad, and I don't know. I mean, I think that kind of feels like that influenced me, like growing up, So I mean, I don't know that it, like I say, that it doesn't portray any admirable ethical beliefs. It seems like it does.
Well, I think if you read the book, sort of the gist of that argument is that the ethics are so muddled that it's hard to could you form an opinion about how you should deal with any challenging ethical issue based on
I see.
referring to Star Wars. I mean, I'm pretty sure David Brin wrote this charge, but that it just seems like you're not allowed to be angry in the Star Wars universe, and if you ever become angry for 1 second, you're irredeemably bad. You've turned to the dark side, and you're irredeemably lost. And I think he sort of says, well, wait, aren't there a lot of things in the world that you should get angry about? And doesn't being angry about injustice motivate us to action? And doesn't just being peaceful, or just does sort of being placid all the time not a responsible reaction to a lot of the state of the world?
Well, I mean, I think the thing with anger and with the Force is that you're just supposed to be able to control it, not let it control you. And it's not that you don't get angry; it's just that you don't let it be outwardly visible that you're angry because you're controlling it. I think that's the thing that is with that. I mean, and I mean, certainly it's not true that you can't get angry at all, because it doesn't make you irredeemable. I mean, like, Luke obviously gets angry at the end of Return of the Jedi, and that's one of the things that makes that scene so cool, is that he sort of gets toward the verge of sort of moving towards the dark side there when he gets angry and starts he feels the power that he sort of derives from that, but then he sort of realizes what's going on and backs away from it.
Much as I love that scene, it's always struck me as a little strange that the Emperor is saying, go on, strike me down, and Luke's like, no, I can't do that because that would be wrong. And I'm like, well, is it wrong? I mean, don't we want him to strike down the Emperor? I mean, wouldn't that be better for everybody?
Well, I mean, I think Luke is saying that it would be wrong if he just struck him down when they weren't, like, because like the Emperor is basically like, murder me, strike me down where I stand without me defending myself is basically what the Emperor was taunting them to do. And I mean, I think that's what Luke is saying is wrong. Not that he shouldn't.
But would that be wrong? And the Emperor's a really bad guy. I mean, he's a genocidal maniac, right?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, that's obviously a real ethical issue in the real world. I mean, like, for instance, like any sort of dictator, is it ethical to just put them down, even if, like, to assassinate them, etc. When they're sort of not engaged in combat with you or whatever. Is that ethical? I mean, it's certainly there's been plenty of debates about that kind of thing.
Well, like on Charge 8, about plot holes and logical gaps, It certainly seems like there are plenty of those, but I mean, one thing that, never really bothered me until I watched the prequels is how can people like Han Solo and the sort of sneering Imperial officer not believe in the Force when just 20 years before Jedi were all over the place and jumping 100 feet in the air and lifting up spaceships with their minds and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's clearly there's a timing issue involved here, and that's sort of a plot problem. Is that, like, these movies should have clearly been, the prequel movies should have clearly taken place much longer ago if Lucas wanted the Force to be this sort of quaint mythical thing that, people don't believe in anymore or whatever. I mean, it's like there's no way in that time period. I mean, Han Solo would have still been alive, or probably would have been alive, right? I mean, I don't know. Was it actually 20 years or was it like 40 years or something? I mean,
well, no, because Luke is born at the end of...
Oh, that's right.
Episode 3.
Yeah,
so
right.
However old Luke is at the beginning of...
Yeah, geez, so it's only like 17 years or 18 years or something, because I mean he's like 18 years old, right? I mean that's what it seems like. That's certainly a time issue. It's like it's like it should have had to been much longer ago than that. Which of course how much longer ago could it have been though? Because like Obi-Wan Kenobi was obviously like 20 or something. But yeah, like I mean, how badly did he age though? Because it's like he looks like he's about like 70 or 80 in Star Wars.
Yeah, and like I'd actually never noticed this before, but someone pointed this out to me recently. Speaking of weird time things, right? How long does Luke train with Yoda on Dagobah in Empire Strikes Back?
Yeah, I don't know. It's only like a couple days, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's not because it's. Because he splits up with Han Solo and Leia at the beginning of the movie, and they get back together again at the end. And so it's whatever amount of time that Han Solo and Leia were fleeing through the asteroid field and stuff is the same amount of time that Luke was training on Dagobah. And it certainly doesn't seem like they're fleeing through that asteroid field for more than 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours, something like that.
Right.
So, I mean, did he, can you really... Is that all it takes? It's like a weekend course to become a Jedi?
Right. No, I think so. Yeah, that's all it takes. Because all you have to do is trust your feelings. So once you learn that, it's all cake.
We asked Alexander if he, was ever into any of the expanded universe stuff or the video games or anything. Were you ever into any of the like video games or toys or?
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, I mean, before I started reading, regular science fiction, I read like all the Star Wars novels that were out at the time. The Timothy Zahn novels, which were like I believe they were the sort of the first books in this revived idea of doing tie-in novels. I mean, Alan Dean Foster wrote one called Splinter in the Mind's Eye, years ago. I think maybe before even the original trilogy was all out, in the theaters and stuff. But aside from that, like, there was a big gap in time where there were no Star Wars novels written, and then when the Timothy Zahn trilogy came out, sort of started this whole thing where now it's an ongoing thing where we'll get other writers to write new adventures and so forth. And I mean, I read all those, and I've played some of the games. I mean, I've played the Star Wars role-playing game. That was pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, and I don't know what I would think of them now if I read them. Now that I've read like a lot of science fiction and I'm older and and I've seen the prequels, but I mean, a lot of that stuff I really enjoyed. I mean, some of the stuff I really liked was there was a comic series as well.
It was the Dark Horse one.
Yeah, the
right?
Dark Lords of the Sith. Yeah. It took place like 4,000 years ago or whatever. So like when the Sith and the Jedi were really all over the place. It sort of deals with this guy Exar Kun, who is mentioned in one of the Kevin J. Anderson novels, or the Kevin J. Anderson has a trilogy of Star Wars novels, and there's this sort of old Sith Lord who's who they sort of encounter somehow. I don't know. He's like from 4,000 years ago, but he's somehow still alive or whatever. I don't remember what the reason was, but so he's in this trilogy of novels, but then Anderson ended up writing this comic series that takes place during the time where Exar Kun comes from 4,000 years before the events of Star Wars, and so like the Sith are sort of all over the place, and I thought that was really cool. Although it's interesting because it sort of shows how like technology in the Star Wars universe like just advances at an infinitesimal rate, because I mean they had spaceships even 4,000 years before, even with the Force. I mean, that's actually kind of ties into one of our conversations we were talking about in Blake Charlton's episode 8. Like, would technology evolve the same way if you had magic? And so, like, with the Force, would technology really evolve at that same sort of similar rate as we've seen in the real world? Like, if you have something like the Force, I'm not sure that it really even makes sense. But, the idea that they could have had spaceships that seem pretty indistinguishable from the ones that we see in Star Wars, that they had that same sort of level of technology 4,000 years before, seems kind of weird.
So, I read the Tim Zahn, Heir to the Empire and its sequels, and I was, just a teenager. I remember them being quite good. I really enjoyed them. But, out of all I didn't read very many of the other ones. Out of all those that you read, do you remember, which ones were your favorites?
Yeah, well, I think the Timothy Zahn books were always my favorite. I didn't like Kevin J. Anderson's trilogy as much, but he had a standalone one after his trilogy called Darksaber that I really quite liked. The Darksaber is actually it's like the Death Star, except that it's they didn't bother to build a whole moon-shaped thing. They just sort of built the big super laser that that destroyed the planets. Mm-hmm. So it's like Death Star version 3.0, except that just pared down. But I really like that one. None of the other ones really spring to mind as being worthy of singling out, but I must have read about 12 or 15 of them. Whatever was available at the time. I know I didn't like all of them, and but yeah, the Zahn books and then a lot of the comics I really liked, like specifically the Sith stuff. So. But as far as other expanded universe stuff, like some of the video games, one of the things I thought was interesting. So in the recent video game, The Force Unleashed, they kind of do something in the plot that seems really kind of strange. I was really kind of surprised that they would allow something so monumental to happen in a video game, that sort of, because usually what happens with sort of media tie-in stuff is that there's only so much you can do that changes the status quo, mm-hmm. because the creator has this sort of idea in mind, and the tie-ins are supposed to work within this certain framework and not change too much. But so in the Force Unleashed, this is kind of a spoiler in the game, but it's it happens pretty early, so I don't know that it really matters. But if you care, don't listen. But in the Force Unleashed, it basically it suggests that, or it not suggests, but it says that Darth Vader actually was working against the Empire all along, and he helped start the rebellion. So I'm like, yeah, I don't know about that. That's a pretty big step to make here. It's we've already, especially after the prequels, where we see where Vader came from, what led him to how he fell from grace and all that and became Vader. It seems kind of hard to believe that even after 20 years or whatever, and the Emperor has done stuff maybe he doesn't agree with or whatever. It seems hard to believe that he would have actually been working behind the scenes to undermine the Empire like that. So it's kind of a major thing to happen, but it was interesting anyway. I think it's kind of necessary to the game, because in the game you play sort of Darth Vader's apprentice, and the idea of the game is that you can sort of play it good or bad, and so go with the dark side or the light side. And I guess they kind of had to, in order to have Darth Vader in the game as much as possible, they had to have him. They had to have some reason for him to be sending you on all these missions and stuff. So, but I'm not really sure it makes sense.
There was this Star Wars computer game I used to really like called TIE Fighter that was a space combat simulation. It was really cool. You would get your mission, so you're a TIE Fighter pilot, and your Imperial officer would give you your mission, and then there would be kind of this suspicious sort of cloaked figure in the corner, and you could go and talk to him, and he would give you kind of secret missions, so you would get kind of secondary objectives if you wanted to, and depending on how many of the secondary objectives you did, it would cause the plot to branch. And so I was never good enough at the game to find out what happened at the end, but I gathered that there was sort of a kind of mutinous Imperial commander, who was plotting against the Emperor, and you could either choose to take his side or not in the game. But one thing that they did, one of the problems they had, it was really kind of fun being a member of the Empire. So at the beginning of the game, how at the beginning of each Star Wars movie there's this scroll that explains the plot. And so they had one of those for TIE Fighter, but it was all just sort of like Imperial propaganda. And it was really kind of fun. But sort of a problem they had is that the TIE Fighters, as they're depicted in the movies, there's always tons of TIE Fighters, which are fast and small and easily destroyed, versus, you know, a smaller number of Rebel ships, which are kind of sturdier. And so they kind of tried to keep that dynamic a little bit in the game, but you're flying around in this little TIE fighter, just blowing up X-Wings and A-Wings and X-Wings and, you know, Y-Wings all over the place. And it's always just you and your wingmen against just tons and tons of Rebel fighters just constantly coming out of hyperspace all over the place. And it just never really felt consistent with the milieu.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the Force Unleashed seems to fit pretty well. I mean, except for, like, you know, like I said, that's kind of a major plot development that happened in a video game, but and sort of goes against a lot of what we already know. But you know, I have to say, it's just so awesome to run around in a video game swinging your lightsaber and like hacking down stormtroopers and stuff. I mean, it's like, to people like us who grew up with Star Wars and like love it like we do, just at this sort of core level, you know, even though we know maybe like we shouldn't love it as much as we do, it's just there's like I don't know if there's much cooler than that. I mean, like, you know, like our friend Carol Pinchevsky has you know, like one of those like full size lightsaber things that like lights up and stuff when you swing it around and it makes the noise, and it's like, oh my god, it's like such a dorky thing, but it's like, that's so cool, I want that, you know what I mean?
Actually, when you were saying before about lightsabers being impossible, I've actually seen some kind of speculation about how you might construct something along those lines involving, you know, plasma contained in a magnetic field, which obviously, you know, is way off in the future if it's possible at all. But I mean, I think there's, at least I gather there's some hope for that. But one thing, you know,
all right. Well, I mean, I was just going with your mentor said, so I mean,
but one thing is that, you know, that if you were to do something like that, what wouldn't happen is that when two lightsabers hit each other, I don't know, maybe if there were, I don't know, it's very speculative, but I mean, one thing I think would be cool if you had a lightsaber type plasma sword, but you couldn't parry with them, right? They just passed through each other. And, you know, like we were talking about a little bit, how like if they used real science in space battles, there would be like new interesting things they could do. I think that would be cool. Something cool to see on screen is like laser swords that you can't parry with, and how does that affect your combat style? And it would just be something new, you know, to see.
You know, and it's funny, like, you know, just speaking of like what the lightsabers will pass through and what they won't, you know, the idea that the Star Wars movies at all are okay for kids to watch is another one of the kind of ridiculous things about the science in Star Wars. It's like, if you think about like what a lightsaber is supposed to be, and you think about how they're fighting with them, it's like, wouldn't a lightsaber battle like be the most gruesome thing ever to like look at, the aftermath of it? I mean, there'd be dismembered limbs everywhere. I mean, you know, it's like everybody's like taking a big huge swipe at a stormtrooper or whatever, looking like it would cut him in half, right? I mean, that's what it must do. Assuming a lightsaber, some sort of laser sword or plasma sword, assuming that's possible, you know, wouldn't it just be slicing through things, like leaving freshly cauterized wounds in its wake? And wouldn't it really smell awful after one of these battles? I mean, you know.
Well, like the scene where
no one ever comments about that. It's like, oh my god, it smells like cooking bacon in here or something.
Well, those scenes like in the prequels where you see all these little kids with their lightsabers and their little, you know,
yeah.
I'm always like, man, how do kids that age like train with those lightsabers and not just kill each other or like chop their own arms off and stuff like that? I mean,
yeah,
you know, would you give like a 9-year-old kid a lightsaber?
No, never. Like, I mean, I'm just picturing like my nephew with a lightsaber. Like, okay, there's no way I would ever let him get near a lightsaber. I mean, it's like you hand it to him and you're going to pull back a stump. I mean, like, it's going to be that fast. It's like, you know, he might kill himself later, but he's going to take parts of you with him.
Well, I actually think, you know, like a really adult, just violent Star Wars movie would be really cool. You know, actually one of the, you know, because we were talking with Alexandre a little bit about rebooting the possibility of rebooting Star Wars, and, you know, have somebody like J.J. Abrams or Zack Snyder, you know, do a Star Wars movie. I mean, one of the best Star Wars things I've seen, you know, in recent years was this Clone Wars cartoon shorts thing. Did you ever see that?
Yeah. I haven't seen all of them, but I've seen it. Yeah.
I really like those, and, you know, it's just an idea of what a different director and different kind of sensibility can bring to it. Just like, so like my, you know, like we both said we kind of liked the Tim Zahn books. I think it would be really cool if they got some new young director, and they would, because like when they rebooted Star Trek, I think J.J. Abrams was saying that for him, Star Trek was always Kirk and Spock, and so if you're gonna do Star Trek, it should be Kirk and Spock. And that's kind of how I feel like Star Wars. It's always going to be Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, etc. And so I'm not thrilled about the idea of refilming, episodes 4 through 6. But I think it would be really cool if they, cast some new young actors to play Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, and had a new young director, and picked up after Return of the Jedi, and just drew on all the books, and just maybe took bits and pieces of them and constructed 3 more movies.
No, I mean, I'd love to see something like that happen. I mean, I even would be completely fine just seeing, episodes 4 through 6, like, being reshot. I mean, I have no issues with that at all. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that would be cool. I mean, if they did do it, though, I honestly think, I mean, they would just hire somebody to write new ones. Like, even though they have all this other material that's good, that's already, fairly worked out, and most of it's pretty good. And, like, for instance, the Zahn books are quite good, and they take place, like, very closely after Return of the Jedi, so it's not like you would have to you wouldn't have to worry about the actors being they're so much older now or whatever. But I mean, I'd love to see that. Yeah.
And that was our show. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you'd like to share your thoughts about any of the topics we discussed today, we'd love to hear from you. Just go to Tor.com and click on podcasts, and then Geek's Guide to the Galaxy episode 11, and post a comment there. And be sure to join us next week when we'll talk hobbits, elves, and balrogs with Corey Olsen, host of the popular podcast The Tolkien Professor. See you then.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Tor.com. For this episode's show notes, or to subscribe to this podcast, visit Tor.com and click on Podcasts. For more information about your hosts, visit JohnJosephAdams.com or DavidBarrKirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Deadsville 9 Entertainment. If you've enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.